one thing, we obviously talked a bit about Bruin and some of the impacts and more of the, on legislation and long-term outlook on gun laws generally. But I'm interested in what you think its impact is on this election that's happening here in a couple of weeks. Is part of this decline in interest on guns, if it is happening, right? As far as the polling is established and some of these other indicators, the fact that the Supreme Court has handed down this ruling and now a lot more gun owners are confident that even if laws are passed, they won't necessarily withstand this test. Do you think that's having an effect, or is that too high-minded?
I hope that that's not the case, because I have no doubt if the Democrats felt like they had the votes in the House and the Senate, they would try to pack the court. They would try to overturn Bruin and McDonald and Heller. They've said as much. So I would hope that, gun owners would not be getting complacent just because we had a good court decision in Bruin. It's important to prevent the court from being packed and those decisions being undone. But I think for most people, the Bruin decision didn't have an immediate impact because, most states were already shall issue. Now, there are some population-rich states, obviously California being one of the may issue states, New York, being another, along with New Jersey. There are now, tens of millions of people who have the right to bear arms that they were not able to exercise a few months ago, at least theoretically. But, look, California is a reliably Democratic state, as is New Jersey, and they don't even have elections. Well, I guess they have their federal elections, but no statewide elections this year. We've already talked about New York and how it's not a top issue even there. So I don't know that Bruin is actually having a huge impact. Not the way that the Dobbs decision seemed to have had, at least for a while. And I think, again, even now, the Dobbs decision is having less of an impact on the race. But, the real, I think, ramifications of Bruin are going to be felt in the courts for a while. And then hopefully the legislatures get the message. Ideally, that's what happens, right? When they get smacked down enough, we stop seeing so many of these gun control laws. But I don't know that Bruin is having a big impact on any particular race right now. I do think it's worth watching to see what happens in New York in terms of the congressional races and in terms of state legislative races, because what we saw in Virginia in 2021. When, Republicans took all of the statewide offices, they recaptured the House of Delegates. That was not supposed to happen in Virginia. And I think that gun control was the sleeper issue of that election. We saw many Second Amendment sanctuaries. Too, right? Exactly. Yeah, absolutely we did. Yeah. And we saw so many Second Amendment sanctuaries in Virginia. And, these same counties, the turnout had increased and it was a redder vote than 4 years earlier. And I think guns had a big deal to do with it. I think you had a lot of people who were waiting 2 years to cast their vote. They were so ticked off. And I think that same dynamic may be at work in New York City, in New York State, once you get outside of New York City in the suburbs. So there could be some upset, swing district races in the state legislature, and maybe even, some congressional districts too.
Yeah, that could be, because New York would be the area where sort of the post-Bruin legislation has had the most practical impact on people, because it's severely restricted the ability of those who previously had concealed carry licenses in places like upstate New York to actually carry their guns where they used to be able to carry them. And so that is perhaps one area where, like Virginia, where people were, I think there's a lot more intense political pushback when a gun law directly impacts people's lives instead of sort of theoretically impacts their rights or something along those lines. You're going to have a more ferocious response when, a more engaged voting community and among gun owners if they're directly impacted. If there was something that they used to be able to do and now they cannot do, I think that drives voting far more than sort of discussions in law journals about
right.
What standard to use or whatever. And so I think it's a good point about Bruin that there hasn't been an immediate impact on most people, and even in places where obviously some of these states are being forced to issue permits now that weren't doing it previously. And so that is a practical impact, but it's one that's is not likely to harm your everyday person who's not going to really notice it, other than people who are going to get the permits and they're going to look at it positively, right? That might generate some interest in voting, like in New York, because if you're having the ability to get your carry permit for the first time, and then that is restricted again because of the politics of your state, maybe you're much more likely to vote on that particular issue. But I do think generally your point makes a lot of sense. Bruin has not led to much immediate, like it has led to some immediate consequences in the courts, but not ones that necessarily have extremely wide-reaching practical implications yet, right? Unlike Dobbs, which has ended up with a lot more restrictions on abortion in a lot of different areas, not everywhere, of course, but that's an interesting, I think, point of view on how Bruin is really why it might not be driving votes in most places. It's certainly something that I think will take longer to have a more political impact, I guess. But I guess one thing I would say, though, to counter that, because I think it's a good point, but you do hear from activists, I've heard from activists talk about, I don't need to worry as much about these gun laws that might be passing because the Supreme Court's going to strike most of them down, after Bruin. Like there's not a lot of these modern type of restrictions that are more controversial among gun owners that will actually survive scrutiny now. And so I don't know.
You don't put all your eggs in one basket. I mean, if that, and you're right, that attitude is out there, I think it's the wrong attitude to have. If you think first of all, the Supreme Court accepts one out of every 10,000 cases that it's asked to. Mm-hmm. So if you think the Supreme Court is going to be the magic backstop that's going to accept every gun control case where a lower court, decides that some law from the 1790s it bears enough resemblance to a modern day gun control law that it can be upheld, I think you're fooling yourself. We as Second Amendment supporters have to be engaged in the legislative arena, in the judicial arena. We've got and hopefully we've got an executive that's going to respect the Second Amendment too. We also have to be fighting the court of public opinion. All of those venues matter. So I think it's way short-sighted to say, the Supreme Court's got to save us. And also, again, as I said, Democrats right now, if they had the votes, would pack the Supreme Court. We wouldn't have a majority. And one of the first things that they would do is overturn the Heller decision. Listen, if it gets to that point, Stephen, I would also say that we would have bigger fish to fry. Speaking as a nation, I think that would be a horrible step to take. And I hope that we don't ever get there. But
it's not impossible. Yes,
it's not impossible, right? Yeah, stranger. So I would just say, don't take the legislative side lightly, and don't think that Bruin gives you a chance to disengage, because it doesn't. It's always better to stop a bad bill from becoming a bad law than to try to overturn a bad law in court.
Yeah, I think from a practical standpoint, that's absolutely correct. I do wonder how much of an effect it has on on people, because I mean, I'm still skeptical ultimately. I think that's maybe an activist thing that you hear from people who are highly engaged, and they're probably going to vote anyway, frankly. If you're that kind of person who's following gun news that closely, you're probably a voter regardless, I would think. And you're sort of average person who votes in a presidential election and might vote in a midterm. It's probably not top of mind for you, the Bruin decision, one way or the other, I would imagine.